Hello seniors, welcome back. It's day 2 of Unit 4. We're going to take a closer look at GDP today. So in our unit packet on page 39, our big question for today is how do we calculate GDP? We'll identify the target range for a healthy GDP, calculate the gross domestic product, and we will look at items that we include in GDP. Our content standards for today, we're focusing on the first one, gross domestic product. We have a 3.0 assessment on Friday, this coming Friday. The key terms that we're going to work with today are numbers 2 through 5. You read about all of these in your text on Monday, but we'll break these into 2 days, today and then tomorrow. We'll look at these last few words. Now taking a look at the do now. Our definition for GDP, market value of final goods and services produced within a country during a given period of time. An important word here is final. And then the 4 components of GDP would be consumption, business investment, government purchases, and net exports. And we'll look a bit more closely at each of these in a little bit. For the equation, we abbreviate that C plus I plus G plus NX, consumption plus investment, business investment, government expenditures or government spending, and then net exports, exports minus imports. And then from this short article, we can identify that the target range for healthy GDP is 2 to 3%. And so then based on the GDP numbers that come out every quarter or every 3 months, we can find that in 2016, quarter 1 was low, quarter 2 was low, quarter 3 was high, but quarter 4 was healthy. Now remember, this is sort of just a range that we want to fall in to monitor our health. It's not as if we want to freak out if we are under 2 or above 3, just like our temperature is going to fluctuate around 98.6. If it's slightly above or slightly below, we're not going to freak out. It's the same thing with GDP, and in fact with unemployment and inflation as well. We have that target range. We want to know kind of where we are at in relation to that 2 to 3%. And this data comes from a government agency, the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So let's go back to our goals for today of calculating GDP and better understanding that. So again, this is all in Unit 4 in Chapter 13 of your textbook. So looking at our definition, breaking it down here, market value is going to be the price that buyers will pay and sellers will sell. And we talked about supply and demand, so this is what we might call equilibrium price, the market value, the agreed upon buying and selling price. We call this the right price. It's also the right price of final goods and services. So that means it's something that's new, that's ready for consumption. It's not a good or service that is going to be used to produce something else. We call those intermediate goods, and we'll look at that in just a second too. It has to be produced within a country. So if we're talking about the GDP of the United States, we're talking about items that are made in this country. Not something that was made overseas and shipped over here. We're talking about stuff that's produced here. And then during a given period of time, typically for GDP, we're going to be talking about every quarter. GDP is published, numbers are published every 3 months. We call that every quarter. But some statistics are published every single month, like the unemployment rate, or possibly every year. So you want to pay attention to the period of time as well. Quick look at the difference between final and intermediate goods and services. Your final is anything new that's ready for consumption. Your intermediate are going to be things that are used in the production of those final goods. So we previously called those things inputs or resources or factors of production. I've got a picture of a tree here that produces rubber, and that rubber is then used to make all of our products that use rubber, like a tire. So that would be an intermediate good or service or a factor of production that's used to make something else. And so pause the video and take a look at these 5 items. Are they final or intermediate goods? And go ahead and discuss. Alright, so taking a look at wood that's used to build a house, that's going to be an intermediate good. It's an input used to build your final good, which would be your house. Breakfast from McDonald's, that's going to be a final good because you are going to consume it. If you're going to consume it, it's probably a final good. Just like gas pumped into your car, you will consume that, so that's going to be a final good. But cotton used to make a shirt, that will be an intermediate good. It's an input used in the production of a shirt. And movie tickets will be final as long as you consume them. You can't use those to make something else. Okay, so know the difference between final, intermediate goods and services. And then lastly, the gross domestic product, we care about where it's made. We want things, if we're talking about GDP of the U.S., we want to make sure it's made in the U.S. And so, again, pause the video real quick and take a look at these two questions. What would you say? Is it included in GDP? All right, American or foreign-owned companies produced goods or services in the U.S. We would say yes, those are included in GDP because they were made here in the U.S. It doesn't matter who owns the company as long as it's made, manufactured, produced here in the U.S. But if it's an American company producing something overseas, no, it's not. It doesn't matter, again, who owns the company, American or foreign-owned. It matters where it is actually produced. Period of time, touched on this briefly before, and this will come up with all of the economic indicators that we look at. For GDP, we're focusing on a quarter. So know that a quarter is every 3 months, and there's 4 quarters in our year. We just wrapped up the first quarter of 2019, and so a lot of economic data is going to be coming out here this week and next week. Now, how do we calculate GDP? Let's take a closer look at this, and this is where you're going to need your calculators in just a minute. We call this the expenditure approach. There's actually 2 methods of calculating GDP, the income approach and the expenditure approach. I like the expenditure approach, but it doesn't matter which way you choose, you'll end up with the same results. Our textbook uses the expenditure approach as well, and so let's focus on that. We simply add everything that we spend, the value of everything that we spend is added together to find the total value of everything that was produced within a year. So those 4 components that we've been looking at before, and notice that this part here, NX, net exports, is your exports minus your imports. You might see a couple of different variables used here. As long as you know that it's exports minus imports, you'll be fine. And so here's a look at 2012 in the second quarter. So this would be April, May, June of 2012. The total GDP in the U.S. was $15.6 trillion. Right? Just huge numbers, hard to imagine that. But consumption was the largest portion of that, $11.1 trillion. So that means that people in America spent $11.1 trillion on goods and services. We bought stuff. Businesses invested about $2.1 trillion. Right? So huge difference there. Government spending was more than business investments. This would be everything the government spends money on. And then our exports minus our imports. Look at these numbers real closely because this is where people oftentimes get tripped up when they're doing the calculations. If we take 2.2 and subtract 2.8, we're going to have a negative number. Oftentimes our net exports in the U.S. are negative, and so our net exports will bring down our overall GDP. So in this case, it's a negative $0.6 trillion for our net exports. We add that to each of these other numbers here. Looking at these numbers, I'm sorry, we'll go back to that in a second. Consumption is always going to be the largest portion. Investment and government spending are always going to be pretty close. And net exports will typically be a negative number. But don't be surprised if when you're doing a calculation it comes out positive. A closer look at those 4 categories. Consumption includes things that we would call non-durable goods and services, so those things that are consumed, they're used up in less than 3 years. That's most of what we buy. But then you have your durables, those consumptions, those things that last for more than 3 years. So appliances, cars, those are things that typically cost a little bit more money. Then you have your services. So this is everything that we buy, from our McDonald's and Tacos Panetta to our pens, pencils, notebooks, backpacks, clothes that we buy for school, to those more durable goods that you might purchase. Investment spending, so this is business investment spending. So think of Tacos Panetta. If they're going to add on an addition to their building there, that's going to be new commercial construction. Homes being built, new residential construction, investments in tools and machines that are used in companies, or changes in business inventories. All of that falls under business investment, the I. Government is easy because that's G, so anything that our federal government or state and local governments spend money on. So anything that our tax money is used for, that's going to be government spending. And lastly is net exports. Make sure you know these 2 terms, exports and imports. Exports would be things that go out of the country, so it's the value of the things that we sell. and then we subtract the value of the things that we buy, that we import. Okay? So we're making money with exports, we're losing money, we're spending money with imports. And one more look at GDP in 2015. Pause the video here and discuss. Alright, we can see that the largest portion of GDP is consumption, here at 69%, and that should not surprise us anymore. Notice that business investment and government spending are approximately the same, and here we have our net exports here is a negative 3%, negative 0.54, I think that's in trillions of dollars. Okay, so just like what we were looking at before, that's the smallest portion. Anything surprise you there? Possibly that this is so large in comparison to these two, that this is negative and brings our net export down. Maybe just simply the size of our GDP is surprising in and of itself. Notice where this came from, the Bureau of Economic Analysis from the Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco. Our Federal Reserve Bank is oftentimes does a lot of analysis with all of this economic data that they get. And what can we learn from this graph? I mean, maybe you want to think about what would happen if consumers did not spend as much money. If the economy was not doing very well, would people be as likely to spend money? And so our consumption might go down, or business investment might go down. If our government leaders changed laws or policies that would increase or decrease government spending, that would affect this number right here. All right, so those are all other indicators that economists would be paying attention to as they analyze economic data, especially GDP. And one more look at it, over the years we see a lot of similar trends here. Consumption being the largest portion of GDP, business investment and government spending has been relatively the same, and then our net exports. Notice here it has become negative since, significantly more negative than in the last 20 years. But we can see, we talk about economic health, we can see that our economy has grown as well, right? We go from trillion dollars all the way up to close to $16 trillion. So the size of the economy has grown. We have pushed the production possibilities curve out. So now let's calculate GDP. There's two calculations that we're going to be doing. Here's the first one. You'll see some problems like this on the assessments. So make sure that you are ready with your calculators. And again, you need your real calculators, not your phones, on the assessment. So given the following data, calculate GDP, and all values are, in this case, billions of dollars. Know your equation if you're going to calculate GDP. Then you're given some data, and then all we need to do is we need to plug this data into our equation. So why don't you pause the video and do that, and then check your answer and see if it is correct. All right, here we go. GDP is your personal consumption of 335, plus your business investment of 105, plus your government purchases of 90, and then we add our net exports, but in this case it's a negative net exports, and so we're going to subtract that, and when we do that, we should get $505 billion. Let's take a look at another one. Here's our data. Go ahead, pause the video, plug that information into the equation, and then we'll look at it together. Alright, so how did you do? Here's our equation again. I added one extra step into this set of data. We've got 456 for our consumption, plus 117 for investment, plus our government purchases. That's the easy part. And then remember, net exports is your exports at 275 minus our imports of 295. So everything that we sell minus everything that we buy. And in this case, it comes out again to a negative 20. And so we should get $628 billion, 628. All right, so make sure you are comfortable with the equation and punching in those numbers. And there's one more calculation that we're going to do here to find out what does this number mean in terms of our target range of 2 to 3% GDP. That's where we have our growth rate formula. So this is a formula that you're going to need later on when we look at inflation as well. So make sure that you know this, and we'll simply replace GDP with inflation, and we'll say new it'll be CPI at that time minus your original. So new minus original divided by original times 100. And so given this set of data, I'm going to do the first one for you. I'll always give you some data, or you'll already have calculated the GDP. But in this case, I want to focus on the growth rate. and identifying if it's healthy or not. So I'm going to do the first one for you. We're going to take the numbers that we're given and we'll plug them in. So we'll have 158.34, which is our new GDP, minus our original, which would be 156, the year previous. So 158 minus 158.34 minus 156 divided by our original, which would be the year previous of 156, times 100, and we round that to the nearest decimal. Always round your GDP to the nearest decimal, and we should get 1.5%. Now we have a number that means something to us. We can compare that number to our target range of 2 to 3%, and just like we did on our do now, we know that 1.5 is low, right? And so is this healthy? We would say no, it's less than the 2 to 3% target range. So pause the video, plug in these numbers for the years 1997 through 1999, identify the growth rate, round to the nearest decimal, and then identify if it's healthy or if it's not healthy. All right, so how did you do there? Let's take a look in 1997. We have 159.97, our new GDP, minus our old GDP, or original GDP, divided by the original, and we should get 0.8%. I think it was 0.77 for the decimal. And so that is not healthy, that's low. So the economy is growing, but it's not growing very much. We want it to grow a little bit more or a little bit faster. 1998, 163.83 minus 159.57, so new minus the old divided by the old times 100, we get 2.7%. And yes, that's within the 2 to 3% range. We would say that that is healthy. And then 1999, we do the same thing, 170.78 minus 163.83 divided by 163.83 times 100, and we get 4.2%. Okay, so we should see that no, this is greater than the 2 to 3%. We might say that the economy is really hot right now, right? And we want to slow it down. Okay? It's running a fever. Right? It's not necessarily bad that it's growing, but it might be growing too fast, and so that can cause problems as well. So there you have it. We've calculated GDP, and now we've calculated from one year to the next to identify the change in GDP, and we can take that number and compare it to our target range of 2 to 3%. And now we'll know when the data comes out, if the news says GDP rose 2.5%, we'll know that, hey, that's pretty good. That's on target. All right, practice with these concepts for your homework on unit packet pages 7 to 8. GDP practice worksheet number 1. Remember, we'll have our 3.0 assessment on Friday. Definitely know how to do these calculations and know your definitions and the components of GDP. Bring your calculator at that time. No phones will be allowed for the assessment. Bring your questions tomorrow when we meet together in class. Good luck.